This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katherine Shen. Back in high school, my friends and I talked a lot and dreamt a lot about what we wanted to be when we grew up. Some wanted to be doctors, others teachers. Unsurprisingly, I wanted to become a journalist. But for kids today, there's a whole new career path that wasn't an option back then: social media influencer. In fact, 57% of Gen Zers said they'd be an influencer. That's according to a survey by Morning Consult, which is a global data research company. But some young people aren't willing to wait to become social media influencers. They're already ones. A Kidfluencer, or kid influencer, is someone under the age of 18 building a presence on social media. Kidfluencers are dominating Instagram and TikTok. They're marketing a wide range of products, from toys to clothes to athletic goods and even skincare. But these parent-run, kid-centric accounts aren't all brand deals and free merchandise. A new investigation by the New York Times showcases the darker side of the Kidfluencer world. Today, we hear about the realities of working in this space and how some young people are advocating to get their privacy back. Up first, we're joined by Jennifer Valentino de Vries. She's a reporter for the New York Times who worked on this investigation. Good morning, Jennifer, and welcome to Where We Live today.
Thanks so much for having me.
And just a quick note for our listeners that there will be some discussions of child sexual abuse in this program today. And so I just want to start, Jennifer, by asking, can you talk about what was the onus of this investigation? How did this all get started?
Sure. This actually began before the pandemic. My colleagues had been working on stories about the proliferation of child sexual abuse material online. And most people refer to that as child pornography. And they had been working on this, and I was really interested in seeing how that problem might be looked at from a different angle. And basically, I was speaking with experts, and they said that, child sexual abuse material is the worst thing that can happen online. And fortunately, it happens to a rather small percentage of the population. It's still far too much, but it's, compared with everybody who's online, fortunately, it's not that many people who are affected by that. But there are other harms in a similar vein that are not as devastating as child sexual abuse material, but affect far more people. And, among these are the harms that might come to girls, young women, teenagers in general, on social media and from influencer culture. So I started just searching online on social media platforms to see, things like tween influencer, tween models. I did not even know that tween influencer could be a thing, and yet there were all of these accounts that were promoting products, and a lot of their followers were men and seemed like they were attracted to these young girls.
And it's interesting that you share that, because just out of curiosity and also research for this show, I did do a very preliminary search on Instagram, and the moment I put teen on it, it's teen fashion influencer, it's pre-teen fashion influencer. And it's just, obviously we'll be digging deeper into this, but what a different world that's out there in terms of social media for young people. And because, you looked at so many different accounts for this investigation. I think in the piece you mentioned that you were looking at about 5,000 different Instagram accounts. Can you talk about what were the types of accounts that you were looking for? Were there sort of parameters that you wanted to meet in order to do this investigation?
Yeah, so the accounts that we were focusing on were those that had multiple pictures in which the child was wearing clothing that was revealing in some way, or very form-fitting clothing, so like gymnastics leotards, dance leotards, bathing suits, a lot of like bra tops, crop tops, that kind of thing, and that were run by parents. So they had some indication in the bio, or had that at some point, indicating that it was run by adults. There are a number of other, like a lot of child influencer accounts that, as you mentioned at the outset, involve things like opening toys, and that sort of thing. And that is not what we were looking at. We were particularly focused on ones that, in our initial reporting, seemed as though they would be most likely to attract people who were drawn to young children in a sexual way.
And these were also photos that were curated specifically, right? They weren't just natural photos of, you're out there with your family taking pictures of, you're playing on the beach, but these were specifically curated for the platform.
Right. So some of them might just be natural snapshots, but most of the accounts we were looking at, they were, yes, clearly taking photos specifically for Instagram and specifically to showcase often some sort of um, apparel or product. So these would not be, for example, gymnastics accounts where it was that consisted of a bunch of videos of the child doing a routine on the floor or on the uneven bars or something like that. It would be children posing wearing the leotards or other attire.
And I know we touched on it a little bit earlier, but it sounds like primarily these accounts showcase young girls, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen to young boys, right?
Right. I mean, there were a handful of accounts that had young boys that were similarly, um, minimally dressed.
Right.
But this was really a handful out of the 5,000.
And yeah, and because this world I think is it's fairly new since the advent of the internet and as how social media has evolved. So would you classify all of these accounts as influencer accounts? Like does the follower number count as a part of that, or what do you look for in terms of classification of influencer accounts?
Right. So it's not really about the follower number so much as it is some level of attempt at monetization, whether that is, actual earnings or just getting discounts on some sort of product or clothing. So we also were looking for accounts where there were indications that there was money or some sort of trade being made. So whether they were brand representatives and advertised themselves that way, or representatives for photographers, um, or had some sort of message about being able to direct message them to ask about rates, or some of them offered subscriptions or asked or just put their Cash App on there actually, and would accept just cash payments.
And just a quick note for our listeners that if you have a child who wants to make it as an influencer, let us know. Or maybe you're working on becoming one yourself. Join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Jennifer, when you were preparing to publish the investigation, I think you all made a decision to not show some of the photos in the post that you've studied. Can you talk about why you ultimately made that decision?
Sure. I think that one of our big considerations was that we were talking about pictures that we knew were attracting um, pedophiles or people who were attracted to children. And we did not want to put something out there that was going to perpetuate that.
Right.
So that was one consideration. We also know that a lot of these kids are, or some of them rather, have been stalked or otherwise harassed online, and we didn't want to perpetuate that either. And I think even if you put, like a black bar or something over a person's face, you can find enough information from the rest of the photo that people can kind of tell who that is. So we didn't want to do that. And then finally, a lot of what this story was about was the importance of context when you're sharing things. So I think a lot of the accounts, a lot of the parents who were doing this, their kids were in gymnastics or dance, and or were on the beach, and what the kids were wearing was very natural to them in some respects. This is just what kids wear when they do these activities. But once you take it out of the context of that activity and you're putting it in front of millions of eyeballs, um, it becomes a different thing, and other people who are looking at it can interpret it in a way that perhaps you wouldn't if you were, at a dance competition. And so we didn't want to take those pictures further out of context and put them into an article that was about men who were attracted to children online.
Right, and especially with what you just described for us, a huge part of of this investigation was taking a look at the followers that follow these accounts and also their engagement on social media. And from your
Mhm.
investigation, you found that a lot of the followers were men who you describe, many of whom openly admit on other platforms to be sexually attracted to children. So, how were you able to discover this and have that being a part of the investigation of this story?
Well, I think when you look at these accounts, it becomes very apparent that some of them, if you know, they are allowing these followers or keeping these comments up, you just click on their followers and you think, well, these are not a bunch of other parents whose kids are in dance or would be buying these outfits. I mean, you can just tell,
Right.
obviously, that they are men. And then some of the comments are, even the milder ones will involve a lot of heart emojis or heart eye emojis and that sort of thing. So it is extremely obvious just at a first glance. I do want to clarify that, you know, a lot of these accounts,
Hmm.
in fact, I would say most of them are ones in which the parents, they keep these accounts up, but they spend hours each day blocking male followers or blocking men who like these photos. And they are just inundated with these men, and they do try very hard to block them. But I think even if they're blocking people from following these photos, it's still a public account. And we know that men are able to screenshot those photos and then they share them on other platforms with men who may themselves have been blocked, but are now nevertheless, able to see these photos.
Right, and based on your investigation, not only are they still able to see the photos, they've also kind of gone off to a different platform to have these discussions and connect that way. So, can you talk about how you were able to connect this all to Telegram, where you found communities of men that exchanges these ideas of being that where they talk openly about being sexually attracted to children and where they're talking about these accounts. And can you also give us a quick idea of what Telegram is?
Sure. So Telegram is an encrypted chat platform. So that means that it's more private than something like Instagram. And, you can connect with people on Telegram just one to one, or there can also be group chats. But it is not quite as open as Instagram.
Right.
Oftentimes you have to know the link and so forth. Um, so, in our reporting, we you know, just encountered a couple of things. There would sometimes be mentions of Telegram in the comments or in the bios of some of these accounts. They would have Telegram accounts themselves that they would direct people to. And then, um, we also heard from people and started talking with people who were either parents or, familiar with this world or had been in it previously. And they told us about these accounts or these chat rooms rather. And, we found links to those through several ways and, recorded those chats.
Right. And
Um,
no,
Go ahead.
go for it. Go for it.
Oh, just and once you got onto those chats, I mean, it was people would refer back to their own Instagram accounts that they were using to follow these children, and uh, would also, discuss their favorite children. And we ran into one group that was very organized. They had a Google spreadsheet that tracked, hundreds of children who were under 18 and gave each child their own hashtag so that, anybody wanting to discuss that child within the group chat would use the hashtag so they could search for other people who were, interested in that child. They tracked the kids' birth dates, and all of their social media handles. It was really extensive.
Well, and what you described is pretty disturbing imagery, really. And I'm wondering, what were your conversations like with parents? What were they productive? Did they know what was happening, or what was that whole process like for you?
We talked with a lot of parents, and again, there was really a range of experiences.
Sure.
From parents who were spending a lot of time blocking, and trying to prevent their images from being taken and put on other Instagram pages that, were kind of advertising to pedophiles or elsewhere on the web. Um, and, it was very productive there in terms of learning kind of the difficulty that was involved in doing that and the
Right.
lengths they had to go to. Sometimes it was amazing to me that they would stay online, particularly because, um, going into this, I think we thought that, oh, these people must be making a lot of money. Otherwise, why would you do this? But most of them are not making much money. They see it more as an extracurricular activity, as something fun to do. Their child likes getting these free things and likes dressing up and, um, having their picture taken. And so, they're not getting, a lot of financial reward out of it. There were other parents who had had darker experiences with this, and, um, you know, had subscribers who were paying for extra images, and had encounters with these men who were trying to get them to sell more photos. And even if those parents, we talked to some who, you know, had not sold really racy pictures or bikini pictures of their kids or anything like that, but it was still a pretty dark experience for them interacting with these men. And then finally, there are parents who have been, um, arrested, charged, in some cases even convicted, um, of producing um, child sexual abuse imagery or nude imagery of their children. And, you know, that was, clearly extremely troubling. But that's, a much smaller number of people.
Right, and you just described a wide range of experiences on social media, and then I think we talked a little bit earlier where a lot of people go into this. You mentioned kids like getting their pictures taken or getting free stuff. That's always a good time, but not realizing the consequences, right? And then you don't know what it looks like until you're actually doing it. So, did you ever come across parents who spoke about regretting that they started this? Because once you start a social media account, even if it's personal, it's not a public account, maybe, but it's hard for a lot of people to shut it down, right?
Yeah, we did speak with parents who regretted um, doing this, or who had at least regretted um, a lot of the things that they had done. And those parents, one mom told us her daughter had been just modeling bikinis online, and that she regretted this because her daughter now thought that, she was 17,
Mm.
that when she turns 18, all she wants to do is start an OnlyFans account and make a lot of money that way. And OnlyFans is an adult platform. And, the mother was um, distressed about this. Um, there were other parents who expressed regret, for um, selling their children's photos. This is another area that we haven't talked about that much, but there are people who um, sell special sort of VIP photo sets. So there are subscriptions on Instagram, but then there are other smaller platforms or sometimes in direct sales. There are parents who will sell extra photos. They'll have men ask them for just any extra photos, and then the men will ask them for, maybe some photos if I send you this bikini for the child to wear. Um, and uh, there were a couple of parents who had done that and later regretted um, doing so.
Well, and because most of the accounts that we're talking about is, of course, kid centric, so they tend to be parent run. So the conversation has been more focused on the adults who are running the accounts. But did you get a chance to talk to any teenagers and kids about doing the work? Did they feel pressured by parents and adults to continue? Because I believe some have verbalized that they don't want to continue.
For the accounts that we were looking at, we did speak to some children, and these were not the children who were, producing um, the uh, kind of private photo set type images,
Right.
in like very small bikinis or anything like that. These were kids who were dancers or wanted to be involved in fashion, and they told us that they thought it was fun and they enjoyed doing it. And I think, part of this is we're not going to speak with a minor who
Right.
is, um, without the approval of their parents. And um, so the parents were there when we spoke with them. And I think just naturally, you can guess that somebody like a child is not going to tell us
Sure.
they don't enjoy this
Sure. Right. Right. Right.
if that's the situation, right? So that was not what we were dealing with. But also, I mean, I think it speaks to the fact that, like, yes, the from the child's perspective, a lot of this is enjoyable. But we spoke with psychologists who told us that, at this age, children are not necessarily going to have the understanding of the permanence of these images. They might not have a full understanding of what exactly it means if a older man is attracted to these images. Um, and, they just do not have the same concept of that adults would have in terms of evaluating the risks. Of course, you know, I think it's entirely natural for a child to think it's fantastic to get free stuff and dress up and get your picture taken. It's totally natural reaction.
Today, we're unpacking an investigation by the New York Times looking into the world of kidfluencers. Jennifer Valentino DeVries is a reporter for the New York Times who worked on this investigation, and she'll be staying with us. You can also join the conversation, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Katherine Shen. Today, we're talking about kidfluencers, or kid influencers. Jennifer Valentino DeVries is a reporter for New York Times, joins us to talk about her piece, A Marketplace of Girl Influencers Managed by Moms and Stalked by Men. And also joining us is Chris McCarty. They are a student founder and executive director of the organization Quit Clicking Kids, which is an advocacy and education site combating the monetization of children on social media. Thank you so much, Chris, for being on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And Chris, you've been listening to the conversation we've been having with Jennifer. Was there anything that jumped out to you that you would like to respond?
Absolutely. I think it's really important that a lot of these parental influencers aren't really aware of the harms of sharing their children online, especially to such a degree. I think that's a really important topic that you both were able to touch on. And I think for that reason, it's really important that we focus media literacy. I think, as a child growing up, I'm from Gen Z, so I was really taught about media literacy from a young age. Don't share your full name, don't share your photos online, don't share your birthday, any of that like personal information. It's always better to just share that with the people who are close to you because there is this perception that a lot of things are okay if they're shared online because there's an artificial distance between the person who's posting and then the people who are commenting and engaging with that media. But I think it's so important to keep in mind that that distance is just that, it's artificial. And so a lot of these images of these children could end up in the hands of somebody who has easy access to them. And it is really important to keep privacy in mind, and then that can help ensure the safety of these children.
Well, and I'm really glad that you brought that up because I do want to talk about privacy with you, and describing it as artificial distance. I feel like I did not grow up with social media when I was in school. It certainly became more popular when I became an adult. And so, of course, being an adult, being on social media is very different from when you were a kid working on social media. So can you talk to us about the privacy of this? Because, Jennifer described earlier that a lot of kids supposedly say that they want to be doing this. It's fun. Becoming an influencer is definitely an increasingly attractive career path for many children and young adults. So can you talk about, what aspects of privacy do kids need to and adults really need to be more aware of?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And to your point about like the children who want to be influencers or want to engage with this type of business, I think that is a really interesting consideration, especially as you both already brought up, like the appeal of attention, the appeal of getting sponsorship deals or benefits from participating in this type of work. I think that especially can be very attractive to children, especially if they aren't able to have the foresight over how this information will come back and impact them later in life. I think there are two key issues. And the first is that in a lot of these cases, because the children are so young, their parents are essentially becoming their managers and their bosses. And that creates a large conflict of interest between the parent and the child. And I think the second issue is that there's this acronym for consent called FRIES, which means consent should be freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And just to quickly break that down, the conflict of interest between the parent and the child makes it a little bit difficult for that to be freely given consent. And especially because these children are so young, they aren't at the legal age of majority. That's another roadblock there. I think reversible certainly speaks to the privacy aspect. Once information is out there, it's very difficult to take it back. So a lot of these children now have this growing digital footprint that they really had no say in creating. For informed, because again, these children are so young, I think a lot of them aren't even really cognizant of the work they're doing at the time, much less the impact it'll have on them later. So it makes it really difficult for like a 5-year-old to say, like, yes, I want you to take pictures of me doing X, Y, Z, and I'm okay with those being online and shared with, whoever. I think that's a very difficult thing for a young child to sort of conceptualize. And then because that consent can't be informed, it can't be enthusiastic or specific, right? These kids can't say like, yes, I'm aware of how this will impact me, and therefore I give my consent for my image and my likeness to be used in this way.
So, can you talk about too, what does consent look like in the digital age? Can consent really be given when the parents are the boss or their managers?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something that I go back and forth on. I think the best thing that a parent can do is to ask their child outright, at least give them the opportunity to just flat out say no if they want to. And then the next best thing I think is to make sure that we have regulations in place to ensure that these kids are as protected as they can be. Because right now we're sort of looking at this new unregulated child entertainment industry. And so these children don't have the same sort of protections that, say, like child actors would have. So I think that is a really key piece. And I've been working on legislation, and part of that legislation is to allow children this right to privacy, to say once they reach the age of 18, they can request that content of them be deleted off of a social media platform. So they do retain some semblance of their privacy.
Well, and you mentioned child actors because when we were discussing about this show, the thread between a child actor and Kidfluencer certainly came up. Can you talk about how similar they are, or how does this work really differently, a child actor versus a Kidfluencer?
Yeah, absolutely. They're both very difficult forms of work. And that's obviously true even if you aren't a child. I think acting is a very difficult profession, but especially for children who are dealing with being in the public eye, dealing with the loss of privacy, performing for a camera. Those are all very real and they're very true both for child actors and for child influencers. I think the key distinction is that child actors already have protections in most states. So, there are child labor laws. There are usually specific provisions for child actors to make sure that they have like a set teacher and to make sure that they're working only certain hours, whereas child influencers don't have those types of protections yet. And hopefully that's something that can change. I think another key distinction to draw between the two is that I've spoken with former child actors, and one of the things they said that really stuck with me was I knew at the end of the day I could just go home and be myself. I knew when I didn't have to be on or performing for the camera. But for a lot of these child influencers, there is no proverbial home to go to at the end of the day. It like the camera can come out at any point. The home is one of the primary places of filming. So that line between their authentic selves and then their selves that they're playing for the camera, like the line gets a little bit blurry there.
And I think another blurry line that we want to touch on is like one of the biggest parts of this advocacy work is the financial aspect of this. So can you talk about if children are entitled to any of the money that this content brings in?
Yeah, so I think there's a really common misconception that a lot of family influencers are sort of taking on this line of work as a side gig or as a hobby, when in fact that's not the case, right? A recent article by Credit Karma came out that said a YouTube account with about 1 million subscribers, if they posted a new video each week, could earn upwards of $900,000 annually through Google's AdSense revenue program. And that's just through ads. That's not through sponsorship deals or affiliate links or merchandise sales. That is only through AdSense. So it is a primary source of income for a lot of these families. And in some cases, it's their only source of income. And that ties back to the what we were talking about earlier with that conflict of interest, right? I think in a lot of cases that can lead to a pressure to perform for these children, where you have parents saying like, "Oh, well, don't you want to maintain this lifestyle? Don't you want to go on these expensive trips that are offered to us by these brand deals? Don't you want to live in this nice, beautiful house that we were able to pay for through your work as an influencer?" So I think that is a little bit tricky.
And Jennifer, I want to bring you back to this conversation. I know we talked a little bit about earlier how these accounts can make a profit and how lucrative some of these accounts can be, especially with what Chris just described. Now, can you respond to that and talk to us about what your experience was like learning about how much profit that these accounts can make?
Yeah, I think it is important to broaden the conversation a bit here. I think what Chris is talking about, is broader than the specific accounts that we were investigating. So there are also child influencers, family vloggers, and so forth who are on other platforms like YouTube, where the monetization, as Chris described, is different. I think, and they are making, a considerable amount of money. It's also the sort of situation where they might be filming for skits, for TikTok or YouTube, and doing different things throughout the day, which is slightly different than the accounts we were focused on, which were concerned primarily with those accounts that were potentially attractive to men, and were on Instagram and a little bit different. So I think there are a couple of things here. Some of the accounts that we were looking at were making 6 figures a year, typically by sales of those extra photos that I was talking about. But I think that what our investigation speaks to is kind of the appeal of the influencer industry, and how broad that appeal is, even if you aren't making, $100,000, $500,000, $1 million a year from this. There are more emotional factors that make people want to continue doing this work, even if it is not necessarily paying as much as you might think. And that then makes this world much broader. You have a lot of family vloggers, like they're a considerable number, but it is not, the tens of thousands of accounts that we're talking about when you expand it beyond those who are the most successful. And so I think it's important from a policy perspective. I think the tip of the spear there perhaps is, rightly looking at the accounts that are making a lot of money and ensuring that children have a right to that, to those earnings. But I think it's also important to consider just how widespread this is.
Right. And speaking of policy, Chris, I want to ask you too, with the legislation that you are actively working on, how would you like to see the laws change around when kids can be featured in social media?
That's a great question. I have been working in Washington State primarily, but that legislation has now been expanded to other states, Illinois, Maryland, California, etc. And the 2 main provisions of the bills that I've helped to craft are to ensure financial compensation for these children. The second part is to ensure a right to privacy for these children. And I think those are both very important provisions, just to say we need to make sure that we're protecting these children. We need to make sure that we're protecting their privacy, their safety, and their dignity. And we need to ensure that the money that they help to generate for their channel, at least part of that is going to them. And that's sort of based off of Coogan laws, set in place for actor Jackie Coogan, who unfortunately had his savings that he created as a child actor stolen by his parents. And those were completely squandered. So what we're hoping to achieve with this legislation is to avoid a whole new generation of Jackie Coogans, essentially. And it's been really promising to see that being taken into other states, to see that like model legislation adapted into other states. I would hope and eventually to see something on a federal level. I think that we're still a ways away from that right now. But I think ideally we'd want to make sure that every state offers the same protections for child influencers.
You've been listening to Chris McCarty, who's a student founder and executive director of Quit Clicking Kids, and also Jennifer Valentino DeVries, who's a reporter for the New York Times, and they will both be staying with us. And if you're a part of the Kidfluencer or influencer world, we want to hear from you. Let us know, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. The influencer industry has become a multi-billion, billion with a B, listeners, dollar industry. And a huge portion of that is kidfluencers or kid influencers. With us today to talk about all of that is Jennifer Valentino DeVries, who is a reporter for New York Times, and Chris McCarty, who's the student founder and executive director of Quit Clicking Kids. So, Jennifer, we've been talking a lot about these parent or adult run kid centric social media platforms. Can you talk about how have the social media companies responded to this?
I think it varies by company, but our investigation was focused on Instagram because that is um, really the hub for the phenomenon that we were focused on.
Right.
And Meta, their parent company, has come under a lot of fire recently for not protecting children who are on its platform, allegedly. And there are lawsuits going on right now from a number of attorneys general, alleging that that Meta, made a conscious decision that it wanted to attract young people to its platform, and that it persisted in doing this despite knowing that, for example, they are exposed to pedophiles and inappropriate interactions with adults. We of course went to Meta with the results of our investigation, and they said that they are putting in a lot of effort to ensure that their systems protect children. But, one thing they also told us a bit surprising to me was that, these accounts are run by parents, that is the protection that Instagram has, that, they're not really allowing children under 13 and the accounts are run by parents, and that basically if the parents don't feel that it's too dangerous, they should shut down the account. And I think that what we heard from parents and what we found ourselves actually was that when they try to report these accounts that are harassing them or sending inappropriate messages, leaving inappropriate comments, the response from Meta is almost always that the account is not running afoul of community guidelines and the account stays up. And I think this speaks to something we've heard from former Meta employees, which is that their system is overwhelmed with the number of reports that they are getting and is, not able to accurately kind of handle these inappropriate behaviors.
Well, and I think even based on this short conversation, we've already dug so deep into the intricacies and how complicated this entire experience can be. And you mentioned a little bit earlier that some parents and some accounts have gotten sort of threats or blackmail or whatnots from their followers. So for parents that might be listening to the show and maybe they're thinking about this, maybe they're not, what do you want them to know about best practices online?
Look, I've been covering technology for, I hate to admit it, like 15 years now. And so I am just totally a Luddite about this. I completely admit it. I, have some social media because I kind of have to for work. But
Sure.
other than that, I am very skeptical consistently of any privacy protections and, safety online. That said, I think that, look, it's safer, of course, if you have a private account. I think a lot of parents told us that the brands that they were working with wouldn't let them have private accounts. I think that that is something that, maybe these worlds of like dance brands and gymnastics brands should consider. You can keep a private account that is pretty large if you are within, a particular community. I think that the only parents that we spoke with who I felt like they were having some sort of success in keeping men away really spent a couple hours in the morning, or like an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, and just delete it. So you have to, it's a job to just get rid of the men. And even then, I think they felt like they knew there were men who were not following them, but were going on and just taking their pictures. So, you know, it is really something to, I think it is just a very risky proposition. And, it's unfortunate. But if I were advising parents, I would just tell them to really consider those risks. It's more than you might realize.
Right. That certainly seems to be the theme of today's conversation, regardless of what social media platform you're on. And Chris, we have about 2 minutes left here, but I want to pose the same question to you. What would you tell parents or even kids about best practices online?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if it's information that you wouldn't readily disclose to, like, say, a stranger that you are waiting behind at Starbucks, then probably don't share it online because there is that problem of artificial distance. And we are seeing more and more sort of formations of parasocial relationships between the children online and then the people who are following and engaging with that type of content. So just being sure that you're only sharing information with people you are comfortable having access to that information.
And I think also because this is a fairly new space for a lot of people, both adults and young kids. And Chris, as you're working on legislation, as you're being very active in these conversations, we got about a minute left here, but what do you hope listeners can get out from this conversation today?
I hope we can all be more mindful about how we're engaging with this type of content. I think social media has a tendency to be a place where we can just sort of relax, turn off our critical thinking skills a little bit. And I don't think that that's inherently problematic, but I think when we're consuming content that features children, we do need to turn those thinking skills back on and be more mindful about the type of content that we're consuming, saying like, is it okay that a child is involved in this type of content? Like, what's going on behind the scenes? What could have been involved to like get them to participate in this, etc. So I think there are a lot of things that maybe we need to be thinking more critically about.
Well, I think turning thinking skills back on seems to be a pretty good advice for regardless of what you're doing. So thank you so much, Chris. You've been listening to Chris McCarty, who's the student founder and executive director for Quit Clicking Kids. Thank you so much for being with us today, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you were also listening to Jennifer Valentino DeVries, who's a reporter for the New York Times. We really appreciate you coming on today and sharing your story with us, Jennifer.
Thank you.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download wherever you live, anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you so much for listening.